Preface and Chapter 1 of The Story of Manhattan. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Story of Manhattan by Charles Hemstreet. Preface. Here the history of New York City is told as a story in few words. The effort has been to make it accurate and interesting. The illustrations are largely from old prints and wood engravings. Few dates are used. Instead, a table of events has been added which can readily be referred to. The index to chapters also gives the years in which the story of each chapter occurs. Chapter 1. The Adventures of Henry Hudson. The long and narrow island of Manhattan was a wild and beautiful spot in the year 1609. In this year a little ship sailed up the bay below the island, took the river to the west, and went on. In these days there were no tall houses with white walls glistening in the sunlight, no church spires, no noisy hum of running trains, no smoke to blot out the blue sky. None of these things, but in their place were beautiful trees with spreading branches, stretches of sandhills, and green patches of grass. In the branches of the trees there were birds of varied colors, and wandering through the tangled undergrowth were many wild animals. The people of the island were men and women whose skins were quite red. Strong and healthy people who clothed themselves in the furs of animals and made their houses of the trees and vines. In this year of 1609, these people gathered on the shore of their island and looked with wonder at the boat, so different from any they had ever seen, as it was swept before the wind up the river. The ship was called the Half Moon, and it had come all the way from Amsterdam in the Dutch Netherlands. The Netherlands was quite a small country in the northern part of Europe, not nearly as large as the state of New York, and was usually called Holland, as Holland was the most important of its several states. But the Dutch owned other lands than these. They had islands in the Indian Ocean that were rich in spices of every sort, and the other European countries needed these spices. These islands, being quite close to India, were called the East Indies, and the company of Dutch merchants who did most of the business with them was called the East India Company. They had many ships, and the Half Moon was one of them. It was a long way to the East India Islands from Holland, for in these days there was no Suez Canal to separate Asia and Africa, and the ships had to go around Africa by the way of the Cape of Good Hope. Besides being a long distance, it was a dangerous passage, for although from its name one might take the Cape of Good Hope to be a very pleasant place, the winds blew there with great force, and the waves rolled so high that they often dashed the fragile ships to pieces. So the merchants of Holland, and of other countries for that matter, were always thinking of a shorter course to the East Indies. They knew very little of North or South America, and believed that these countries were simply islands, and that it was quite possible that a passage lay through them which would make a much nearer and a much safer way to the East Indies than around the dread Cape of Good Hope. So the East India Company built the ship Half Moon, and got an Englishman named Henry Hudson to take charge of it, and started him off to find the short way. Hudson was chosen because he had already made 2 voyages for an English company, trying to find that same short passage, and was supposed to know ever so much more about it than anyone else. When the Half Moon sailed up the river, Hudson was sure that he had found the passage to the Indies, and he paid very little attention to the red-skinned Indians on the island shore. But when the ship got as far as where Albany is now, the water had become shallow, and the river banks were so near together that Hudson gave up in despair, and said that, after all,
Sample complete. Ready to continue?